Well, welcome to Q&A Sunday. This is one of my most exciting times of the year.
Yeah.
I get to ask whatever questions you guys have given. For those of you who may be new, this is one opportunity a year where people have submitted questions, and it's our opportunity to get to ask Pastor his thoughts. And we have a little bit of variety today of questions, everything from some biblical understanding questions, and we got some intercessory prayer questions, and just some what I call tactical questions. So if you're okay, kind of get started, an easy one. You guys have been on a trip.
Yeah.
Tell us about it. How was it? Did you guys enjoy yourself?
It was wonderful. We had a wonderful time with Aaron and Cecily and Andrew and Bella. Some of you that saw on Facebook, we had a chance to go to my hometown in Oklahoma because my grandkids had never been there. So I thought, they need to begin to understand a little bit of their heritage, and went back to the little town Comanche where I was born. When Grace and I were there several years ago, the only thing left of the hospital I was born in was the front steps. We went to take the grandkids, and the steps are gone. So there really used to be a hospital there, and that's where I was born. But it was just a wonderful time, and basically the nativity scene I talked about a couple of Sundays ago that was in front of Halliburton Company when I was a kid. They had it set up in front of the First Methodist Church, and so we were able to go up to it and actually be there, and took a picture with Bella there in front of it. And that was just kind of cool to go back to my childhood and see that. I think probably the most frightening thing about our trip is that our grandson got his learning permit while we were there. And he did drive a short stint when we were coming back to the house, and all went well. So, but it's been a great trip, great time.
Yeah, I saw some social media posts on that. And, even I felt a little old when I
think his parents are going to have a few more gray hairs in the next few years. So.
Gotcha. I would think you would feel even older, though, from that. But anyways. All right, so fortunately, we have a lot of great questions, which means we're going to kind of jump into some big ones.
That's all right.
Right off the bat. I didn't have any warm-ups of what do you think about the Cowboys this year, none of that. So we're going to jump right in and kind of go deep, and then I'll mix in some of the tactical ones kind of as we go, just to kind of break things up. All right, so this is one of those biblical questions. What do you think will be people's understanding when they arrive in heaven of certain loved ones who rejected Christ and are not in heaven? So will they have any realization that they're not there, that kind of a thing?
I think they're going to have some realization, but I think the scripture says we're going to know even as we're known. So we're going to operate from a different place than we've ever operated before. And so I think there will be a certain supernatural comfort, and there will just be an ability to come to terms with it that'll be different, because we will be totally made perfect. And so I think, sure, it's a challenge, but I think that the Prince of Peace rules there, so there will be peace in the middle of that.
Yeah, and that's a great question.
It is.
As I read through some of these, I was like, man, that's really deep. I will also say, I think I was challenged as I read it to even care even more now, because obviously I believe in that peace aspect.
Absolutely.
But I would rather avoid that part of it.
Now's the time to make a difference, isn't it?
Have those folks there. All right, so just kind of right into the next one here. It says, when Satan fell from heaven, why didn't God bind him in the lake of fire, but still give man a choice to sin or not, just like Satan was able to do in heaven?
Well, I think because God is who he is, and he doesn't want puppets, and so he gives free choice. And so I think allowing him to be on earth was a chance for us to make the right choice, the right decision, and that the whole scheme of God's eternal plan is ultimately that Satan will be punished in hell for eternity, but that it still had to all be carried out in what God wanted to fulfill. And he wanted us to choose to love him. And so Satan became the antithesis of that. That was the opportunity we had to decide which way are we going to choose.
Fantastic. So, you talk a little bit about that, but I mean, people would still have free choice.
Yes.
Even if in this scenario, but that good versus evil aspect of things. I mean, do you think that's, why would God still make it that way versus just allowing me to make a choice on my own?
Well, because I think evil is a reality, and Satan becomes the personification of evil. And so basically, he's in charge of the evil opposition to God. And so I think because of that, then God didn't just wipe him out. God could have wiped him out, but the evil still emanates from him. And so I think there was a certain amount of that he needed to be present for evil to have the ability to be organized in the way hell's organized, that we would then have to be challenged with it.
Okay. Switch gears.
Okay.
Let's go to a more tactical question. Why do we here at LifeBridge do the same Bible reading every year versus mixing it up just a little?
Well, honestly, and maybe we should present it this way. The Bible reading that we present every year is what I would call entry level. It's designed so that if you've not read the Bible through before, you can do it in a very easy way to get started, because invariably the only thing you get challenged with is the book of Matthew, where it does all the genealogy of Jesus' lineage. But you don't get bogged down in Old Testament law. You don't get bogged down in some of the other things with the Old Testament. And we also don't include the book of Revelation. It isn't because we don't believe the book of Revelation is real, but that's another place people got bogged down. And so what I want is for people to get hungry for God, and this just provides a great entry point. Now, by no means do I want you to feel limited to being that your Bible reading plan, because there's so many different kind of Bible reading plans that you can do that are wonderful. The YouVersion Bible has all kinds of different opportunities, and there's many more. But it's basically just every year that it's a challenge more than it is a prescription.
Absolutely. So, I think there was some good points there. As a matter of fact, that was one of my follow-up questions is, what do you have any recommendations for alternatives? And I do think that YouVersion app, if you don't have it, you should. That's a great Bible app. Yeah. But not only is it just the Bible, but there's also a lot of reading plans in there. There's a lot of, if you want to listen to it, for those of us who may do a little bit better with that at times. If you're wanting to go watch other videos and things like that associated. And there's Moravian Bible, Daily Bible Devotions, a great one to do. Lead Like Jesus has an everyday Bible reading plan. And so just a little pitch there, Rich. That's a great one. And there's just a number of ones out there. And the YouVersion, again, becomes an easy resource. Yeah, so a shameless plug for Lead Like Jesus. Fantastic opportunity right there. I have to say, Do It Best Corp right now, too, just to get my shameless plug in. Absolutely. Sorry, just a little humor for the morning. All right, so back to some biblical understanding questions. And this one, I think you actually covered it recently, so I'm going to ask not to hear the whole sermon, but... As if that would be possible? Yeah, right. Yes, we don't have any notes here, which may be a different issue. But do you believe the rapture will happen at the time of Jesus' return? I believe that there's ultimately two returns. There's the catching away, and that's not going to be a visible return other than to those of us who go with him in the rapture. The actual second coming of the Lord will be at the end of the 7 years, and we'll come back with him for that return when the Battle of Armageddon and then the 1,000 years of peace. And that's my viewpoint. There's other theological perspectives that other people have, and I believe I'm right. If you're right and you believe otherwise, I'm going to come borrow food from you during the tribulation. Yeah, this is always one of those questions, as I've even thought through it personally over the years. I believe very similar. On the same token, I'm one of those, whatever happens. I'm not going to change my belief in Christ, and I can gain as much knowledge as I can from the Bible, and the rest of it's just going to be. Yeah. And I believe we're going to be in good shape. Yeah. If you ever hear that LifeBridge Church is selling food rations for the tribulation, you will know I'm no longer the pastor. I think a lot of things will be different if that's the case. Okay. So here's an interesting question. Biblically speaking, Is there a reason to not be cremated?
Boy, that's a tough one, and it's a shifting understanding in our culture. I don't know. My first 20 years in ministry, I did more than one or two services where there was cremation. It was always a burial, and traditionally, in biblical tradition of Jewish faith, in the Old Testament, you read in the Old Testament, saints were buried. I've been to where Abraham's grave is supposed to be. And the only known cremation in the Old Testament was King Saul and his sons. And that was after their bodies had been desecrated. He had been beheaded in battle. And so they were actually cremated. There are people, because the church has traditionally believed in burial. In the New Testament, it was referred to as if burial was the practice. I think it's been more of tradition than it is an actual. There's no scripture that really speaks to this. The other issue that some people take is that there are pagan cultures that the ritual of cremation becomes a part of the ritual of that pagan culture. And yet, that's cultural. That's not a reality. And so I don't think biblically you can build a case against cremation. And it's becoming more and more common. Right now, it's about half and half of people who die are either buried or cremated. They project that in the future, it could be as many as 75% will be cremated. And so I think it's going to continue to be a part of where we are. There's ways that you could, part of why you did burial was so that you could have a service where people could see the body, get in touch with the reality of the death, and have a chance to have their mourning with that person's body before they're buried. Now, frequently today, you can still do that before the cremation takes place if you choose to, but one of the biggest issues is the cost of funerals has just become exorbitant. And I really struggle when I know that there are people who spend a ton of money for a casket, for a vault, for all the things that go with that, and it means nothing to the person who died. They're not impacted at all. And I just think that some people end up spending a lot of money they shouldn't have to spend. So personally, I lean more and more toward the idea of cremation, and I don't think there's anything biblically that would argue that is the wrong thing to do. I think it's a personal choice.
Yeah, so let me follow up a little bit on that. So I heard you say a couple things. From a biblical perspective, we don't necessarily have a whole lot of things aside from tradition that really say that it would be a problem. Mm-hmm. And then, you have that pagan element of burials that have happened with that. But for that matter, there's probably some pagan rituals where people were buried. So therefore, we could find many things that go both directions as it relates to
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay. I don't think I've ever used the word fantastic in the same question as cremation before, but there you go.
Yeah, that's true. So it's all ashes at the end.
Yes. All right. So let's talk a little bit about intercessory prayer. And we have a couple of different questions that come in line with this. So very interesting. If I pray on behalf of another person because they don't pray, is this a form of intercessory prayer?
It is a form of intercession because you're praying for them. You can't change another person's will. They have to choose to do that. What you can pray for when you intercede for someone is that God will organize things in their life so that there will be people who come to them to share with them what they need to hear, so that there will be work that the Holy Spirit directly speaks into their heart, that there will be ways that God works to change their way of thinking, soften their heart. And so I do think we need to intercede on behalf of people, believing that God is going to change them. I think there's a lot of people who will be in heaven because their parents and their mothers particularly interceded for them and didn't quit praying until there was a change.
Yeah, and that actually follows into this next question, and from my handwriting analysis that was written by the same person, and I think it was written on the back of the same card, but that's besides the point. But as I read about this question, and as I ask it, you'll see somebody here has a very deep concern and care for somebody close to them. So I can appreciate that. But and you kind of already alluded to this, but it says, through intercessory prayer, can I ask God to forgive another person's sin, especially when that person has no relationship with Jesus Christ?
You could ask God to bring them to an awareness of the need for forgiveness, but we can't do penance for someone else's sin. If you want to take it to that level, you can't opt out for them what they have to take responsibility for, because ultimately we are responsible for what we do, and so they have to come to a place of asking for forgiveness. Otherwise, then we could pray people into salvation that never asked Jesus into their heart, and you can't. So ultimately, they have to make that decision.
Yeah, and I think that kind of comes back to, and we've kind of alluded to it, that whole praying for others.
Yes.
I think that's where the challenge, and then obviously reflecting Christ in our own lives. Again, creating that awareness, and then also showing it's worth it. It's something I want to be a part of.
Absolutely.
Well, since we talked about intercessory prayer and obviously some deeper questions on it, do you have any resource recommendations or anything off the top of your head? And again, I know this wasn't something you're prepared for, but any thoughts on that?
There's some great materials out there. Jack Haver's written some good books on and good thoughts on intercession. There's a number of resources that would be available if you went to Charis Bible College and looked for resources on intercession. That'd probably be a good place to look and see. I'm going to hit Pastor Grace. Is there anything you can think of off the top of your head? Yeah.
So that was Benny Johnson?
Yeah, Bill Johnson's wife, right? Yeah, okay.
So a couple good resources, and again,
Yeah.
For those who maybe whoever asked that question, but for anybody else, if you have questions on resources like that, I highly recommend talking to our pastoral staff, talking to some others on the prayer team. There are some great resources
absolutely
out there. I know, for myself, I grew up in the church, and I had a grandmother who I got to witness what intercessory prayer was, as she would be up at 3 a.m. Praying for people, and that was an amazing thing. But not everybody had that type of a history, so I can only imagine the need for resources.
Yeah, Grace, what was the guy's name in World War II that was such a prayer warrior in England? Rees Howell. If you Google Rees Howell, great stuff on intercession, because I really believe the course of World War II changed because of he and the intercessors that were involved with him in England during that time.
Yeah, I think, as I spent some time, I get the privilege of reading these questions ahead of time, so I've thought about them more than anybody. And, it definitely hit me that the need for prayer has never been greater. Not only just in our country, but just in where we are as a body of Christ. And so continuing to learn more, I highly challenge people, if you do nothing else this year, learn more about prayer.
Yeah, absolutely. George Mueller would be another person. His life was, he believed God to feed orphans every day and prayed. And it's a phenomenal story of how God did that.
All right, so let me go back to another tactical question. And I will tell you guys, today's question, sometimes some years we've shared with Pastor all the questions ahead of time and with Grace, and we went through them and talked about them. And this year, for the most part, we really didn't discuss any of these questions, so this is coming from the heart in the moment. But there was one question I did share with Pastor, and the reason for that is the emotional side of this question. And I can't speak for him because we didn't talk through his thoughts, but I will tell you, when I read this question, my heart broke. I was actually very saddened, and for a moment didn't even want to ask it on stage. And part of that's because it's a little bit vague, but on the same token, I thought it was important for us to talk about it. So the question was, why does the leadership and pastors here at LifeBridge show obvious favoritism?
Wow. It's a hard question. And I want to be very honest with this and hopefully insightful. Number one, I would hope that we never intentionally ignore anyone. And to my knowledge, Pastor Grace and I both would really be open to real correction if we were intentionally ever doing that to anyone. On the other side of the equation is one person, two people. There's only so many people that you can have close interaction with. There's limitations to what you can do and how much time you have available. And once a congregation reaches a size of 75 or 100 or more, the dynamic starts shifting and changing, and the larger it gets, even the more they shift in what you're physically capable of doing with people. The other thing is, to me, you always look to Jesus as the example of how should we pattern ourselves in what we do in leadership. And if you think about the ministry of Jesus here on earth, you will look and you will see that he had the multitudes that he ministered to. And so literally there were thousands of people who would come to hear him and to be touched and healed, and miracles worked on their behalf. And you'll see that Jesus, one of his challenges sometimes was being able to withdraw from that because of the pressure that created, so that he literally had opportunity just to rest, because it's taxing to engage all the time. And then Jesus had the 70. You remember the group that he sent out and he told them to go and do works for him? And so they were a group that were closer to him and had more direct contact with him than the multitudes did. And then Jesus singled out and called 12 people that spent every day with Jesus for 3 years. And they were with him all the time. Those were the disciples. And then out of that group of disciples, remember the Mount of Transfiguration? All 12 disciples weren't there. It was just 3, Peter, James, and John. So really, they were actually in a closer affinity with him than the 12 or the 70. And so I think you look at the Jesus model, but I think it isn't just a biblical sense, even though I think biblically we do look to that. I think it's a understanding who we are as people, how God made us relationally. God intended us to be in relationship. That's why he created Adam and Eve, so that they could walk in the garden with him every day. But the relational capacity in us has limitations. The other thing is, God created all of us as unique individuals. So we all have different personalities. And some of us are more introverted. Some of us are more extroverted. I'll just frankly tell you this. By nature, I'm an introvert. When I walk through the door on Sunday mornings, I have to say to myself, kick into gear. Because I know now I need to start interacting with people. But by nature, I really don't like to be in large crowds. And another thing that I've learned through the years, and this has been particularly helpful to Grace and I as a couple, is we all have different ways we process. And what we've learned is that I am an external processor, Grace is an internal processor. And what I mean by that is, if you come say something to me, I'm going to beat it to death talking about it. But that doesn't mean that I've come to an answer yet. That means I'm processing, and I process out loud. On the other hand, Grace is an internal processor. If I hit her with an idea, I've learned it's better to hit her with the idea and just leave it there for a while. And best is I don't bring it back up till she does. because then when she does, she's ready to talk about it. And the more we've learned how to understand each other, the better we get along. But you also have to understand that still impacts how we interact with other people. And so if an external processor comes to talk to me, we're going to have a conversation. If an internal processor comes to me, I may go further than you want to go in conversation because I don't understand that. And if you approach Grace and you feel like she didn't say much to you, you may think, well, she doesn't like me. No, she's an internal processor, and she's going to need to have some time to think about it. And so those are just realities. And then there are people that we just have a natural affinity for. I remember before Grace and I met some other people, and I had an evening or two where I invited someone out for dinner just to see, is this somebody that there might be a long-term relationship with, that I couldn't wait for that one time to be over, and I regretted that I invested the money in that evening. Because I knew that we just didn't have good chemistry between us.
I hope they're not watching.
Yeah. When Grace and I got together, there was just a chemistry that became apparent in the emails. And then when we met in person, it was just obvious there was a natural chemistry. And it's not just with a couple getting married. There's people you have better chemistry with, and that's not judging either one. We're just all different. You have to remember that all those things play into the equation as well in how you interact with people. And basically the principles Jesus operated with, there's been a number of books and ministries that have taken that understanding and built models of this is how a church needs to function so needs get met. And basically what Jesus did was took what has been defined in several resources. One of them is the book called The Need to Belong by Joseph Meyer. It's a great read. And basically it talks about 4 social spaces. That basically there is public space, which is us gathered here today. That's a large group of people coming together, and we all participate at some level in public space. Social space is more a group of 20 to 50 or 60, is like the 70 Jesus sent out, that come together a lot of times around a cause or because they want to do something together, but it's not a close group, but it's still closer than just the public space. And then we all have personal space. And generally there's anywhere from 10 to 20 people when you're in that personal space that you're going to engage with. And a lot of small groups are built around that understanding. And then there's intimate space, and that's where Jesus had the 3, so that there are people you're going to be close to. And so that's true for us, Grace and I, for any pastors, and that's true for churches. There has to be, and you may notice if there's small groups going on, we don't try to make the meetings. Occasionally we may come to a special thing for a small group, but we don't go to small groups that someone else is leading, because that is a personal space that we don't have capacity to be involved in. And then there are people that need intimate time with each other that we don't need to be involved in those conversations, and so we don't. The social, we're more likely to run into a lot of people there, and then the public space, because that's the overall calling of what we're called to do in bringing leadership to the church. So what we try to do is make sure that there are opportunities for those smaller gatherings, because we can't do all of them. Also, there's going to be natural affinity. The people who are in leader roles, the people who are on staff or church council or missions council, Grace and I are going to react more with those groups, because we're working together for common purpose. And also we believe that staff and there's certain people that we work with, and now that we're working with our teenagers, that we want to spend some time to disciple them, that we come close to. Then you look as a pastor, not only do we have what we need to do here, but we're involved in the community. One of the things that I've just agreed to do is everything is coming together that by October of 2022, if everything continues to move the way it is, there's going to be a 24/7 prayer room that's going to be happening at the Electric Works in the Do It Best building. And I'm going to be a part of the initial advisory committee for that. That's another group of people that we're involved with outside the church. Grace and I have a couple of people outside the church that we look to help us process and think, that we trust spiritually, that we trust with their understanding of things, so that we're able to make sure that we're thinking healthy and not just inside a bubble. There has to be margin of time for that. Grace serves on the board of Lead Like Jesus, and so there's ways we're involved that directly affect ministry outside of the church as well, and so there has to be margin for all of that to happen. So I definitely would say this: it's never an intentional thing that we would just avoid anybody. But it is true, there are going to be people that we're not going to have opportunity to be as close to, and there's going to be people that it becomes more natural for. What I'm going to be looking for, because by nature I'm a networker, if you haven't gotten connected somewhere, I'm going to be looking to try to get you to connect where you will be able to have, because we need that community. We need to be involved. So again, I don't think there's ever an intentional thing that we're trying to shut people out, or that we're just trying to be with people because it's party time and those are the people we want to be with. And yet I will tell you, there are people that it's going to be more natural with us because we're involved and we have common interests. And so there's just some natural of that happens. But it's never an intentional snub anyone. It's just trying to live in the context of what we're capable of doing as individuals. So I don't know if that helps at all, but that's kind of a perspective of why it may feel that way sometimes.
Well, and again, I knew this was this type of question obviously touches one emotionally.
Yes.
But what I would say is this, and I've known our pastoral staff for a long time. I've known many of our leadership for a long time. One, we are humans. So I won't say mistakes are never made, but I personally know their heart. And it is not a heart that would ever want anybody to walk away feeling like favoritism in a negative way is being given. There is, of course, those things like you've talked about where people get closer because of different things. I will also say this, and this is my recommendation on a personal level. If that was, because we only got one person who asked this question. Sometimes we summarize questions because we got a number of them. But if you're an individual who's definitely, if you felt either hurt or concerned, I highly recommend you come to Pastor Grace and Bill or whoever in leadership and ask questions. Absolutely. Because I can assure you where heart is. But again, are we all ever going to agree on everything? No, we're not. But I know where their heart's at, and I know they want to speak to you individually.
Absolutely.
All right, boy.
Yeah.
I can tell you that's the toughest one of the whole.
Well, good. That's a hard question, and my heart goes out to people who don't feel like they're a part of community. I do hate that when that actually happens to someone.
Well, if nothing else, it proves I'll ask anything up here.
Yeah.
I wanted to accidentally lose it. Okay, so let's a little more tactical. Are we going on any missions trips in 2022? And I guess there's some practical sides of that, but and I have some follow-ups to that. But
yeah.
Are there any planned mission trips this year?
There's not at the moment anything that's set. There's a real good probability that Pastor Grace and I may be going to Gambia with Saul and Manuela Baugh. They have not been back on the ground in Gambia because of Saul's health and then COVID for about 3 or 4 years. And so they've asked us when they go that the two of us would go with them. We're looking at potentials. One area would be, again, to have a group go to the Dominican Republic. I would love to see us have more than one building trip coming up. There's nothing that I would say right now is in solid plan. But I would also say this, we're open if there's any of you that have background in leading missions trips and would be open to being involved in leading a trip, there would certainly be openness for us and for you to meet with the Missions Council and present what you're thinking about. Another thing that will be happening that's not a missions trip per se, but it has some of the same dimensions of what happens at a missions trip is going to be the Holy Land trip in the fall. And by the way, next Sunday after church, Russ will be in the community room. If some of you are ready to actually register for the trip and you need help working through the registration papers, he'll be there after church next Sunday, can help you do that. And so there will be elements of where that will have some of that, but it's not a missions trip per se. But I would hope that somewhere this year we would. The other caveat is it's still such a challenge of knowing what you can do with travel related to the whole world of COVID, because that's still a major unknown. And we still are going to have a missions trip going out of here, just like Steve and Danae will be heading to Kenya in just a few days.
So let me ask a couple follow-up questions to that. Are there any opportunities maybe within Foursquare or other organizations that you're aware of maybe for somebody who's looking to go on a trip?
Yes. Yeah, there would be opportunities within Foursquare. So, you could contact FMI directly, or we'd be glad to make contact for you. I know that the Assemblies of God have a number of short-term mission assignments that you can set up to do in their world. If you want to have a taste of missions but not go out of the U.S., there's ongoing, and I can put you in touch with this, with Foursquare, there's ongoing ministry that happens among Muslims in Detroit. And that's going on all the time. And you can, a lot of times, now that's been, again, a little challenge with COVID, but I'm sure that'll begin to open back up this year. So that'll be a possibility. In the past, there have been summer opportunities in Chicago to do inner city ministry. And so some of those are going to be coming. I know that Aaron Hunter, who was with us a year ago, he's now over all missions for Foursquare in North, Central, and South America, and he's going to be looking for people who would want to come do, if you wanted to just come and spend some time on a short-term 3 or 6 month thing, he would work with you on that, or even a shorter time. So there's various opportunities that are definitely there now that we could talk about. The biggest question at the moment would be, how do we work around whatever the COVID issues are in that particular location?
Yeah, and I know many organizations are hoping that this year things open up. It's not just wanting to plan a trip, it's the logistics of getting a group somewhere and knowing you're going to be able to take care of them the entire time. Let me ask this. How many of you have been on an overseas missions trip before, with a raise of hands? Okay. First off, highly recommend finding the opportunity to go on a trip. But let me ask you this, because I've been asked this question, and quite frankly, ask it of myself. Why do you think missions trips are important? And I'll put a caveat in there. Wouldn't it just make more sense to take all that money you're going to invest in that trip and just send it to a missionary?
From a missionary standpoint, that's probably true. Seriously, because it is expensive to go on a missions trip. But what I do know is I've known many people whose lives were forever changed because they went on a missions trip, because of what they experienced while they were there. And what it actually did with them is open their hearts, where they became far more generous to give more to missions than they would have given if they had just given that money to missions. I think that there's meaningful things that can happen on a missions trip. There's also times that you can be an encouragement to the missionaries that are there. So a lot of it depends on how the trip gets focused and what happens with it. But I think more than anything, it just opens your heart up, and it also gives you, we are so caught up in American thinking. And I want to tell you something, you spend a few days in a third world environment, and you'll look at things a little differently than you do before you do that. And so I think, honestly, it's more for what it does in the individual sometimes than what the trip itself accomplishes.
Yeah, I watched a group as we were in the Dominican, and I think Pat Bendel and some others were with us, and as we're getting ready to leave, they're emptying their bags, they're giving away their boots, they're giving away their tools. I mean, some of them are great tools too. I mean, just everything they have, it's like, what do I really need to take back? And it was just important to bless those you were with, because your heart, man, it just goes out. It does change who you are as an individual.
Yeah. Another thing that I think we sometimes forget, because when I get over there, I start looking at what can we do to improve their lives from an American perspective. And you know what? Sometimes they don't want what we have. And they may be better off not having what we have, because their lives are simpler. They're fulfilled. We're looking at it from a Western point of view. They're not. And so I think the other thing you have to be careful is when you do go, not to think that you need to fix it for them. And if you go on a missions trip, make sure that you are in touch, that you're with someone who has an understanding of an international perspective with you, so that you're not caught up in trying to meet needs that you shouldn't be trying to meet. Because one of the things that will happen is frequently people will go on a missions trip, they'll see a need, and they'll go fulfill it, and the missionary that is there is just cringing, because they know it's the absolute worst thing you could be doing for that person and for just the precedent of what it says. So it's very important that when you do go, that you're very connected to someone who has a broad understanding of an international worldview, and someone who also has understanding of the culture you're in when you go there, and what's the best thing that you can do for that culture, and not get caught up with individuals there who see an American and say, oh boy, now I've got what I always wanted. Because that happens. And it's important that you look at that if you do go.
Yeah, I had a missionary friend of mine who said that when he interprets for teenagers, they'd have teenage groups then, he goes, at times he may or may not actually interpret what they said, because they'll say things like, I am so thankful to God that I don't have to live this way, with others in the room. He says, I may change those words when I tell the group what they may have said.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's good to have somebody with some perspective.
Absolutely.
All right, so here's a very tactical question. Why don't we sing more Christmas carols to celebrate Christ's birth? I assume this is during the Christmas season. Maybe they would want this all year round. I'm not sure about that part.
Oh, well, if wishes and butts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. That was bad, wasn't it? The truth is...
Some questions I should have asked ahead of time and let him prepare for it.
If we did a survey of do we sing enough carols, should we sing more, you'd get all kinds of responses. There's some people who want us to do nothing but continue to have worship like we always do. There's some people that would want us to sing nothing but Christmas carols during the season. So we try to do some kind of a mix of that. And I'm sure that it doesn't totally scratch every itch. And I understand that question, and yet I think it is a deal where you're just trying to somewhere reach some form of happy medium in the environment of both continuing regular praise and worship, and then also in actually enjoying the carols of Christmas.
Yeah, and I understand that. I know, Christmas Eve service obviously was a great opportunity, and a lot of these questions are actually even submitted before then, but
yes.
Good opportunity for that kind of a thing.
Yes.
But again, balance, I think, is what I hear, trying to make sure that we're coming forth with the right things. I will tell you, if you need more of that, just come to my home. About year-round, there's plenty of it playing in my house. For some reason, we have to play Christmas all the time, so if that helps. Sorry, that was personal share. All right, back to a biblical understanding question. And this is great, because again, you read people's heart in some of these questions. It says, how would you explain the Holy Trinity to a child? And the follow-up to that is, and what age is the best to do so?
Well, that's a good question. I think probably if they're asking, I think sometimes we may try to load more on children than they're ready for. And so sometimes simplicity of just loving Jesus is enough. But I think if they start asking questions, I think you can answer. I think one of the best answers I've ever seen comes out of when I, years ago, for a period of time, tuned pianos for a living. In the middle and upper register of a piano, if you open it up and look at the strings, all those notes have three strings that the hammer hits. When you hit the note, then the hammer hits, and there are three strings that get hit at the same time. But if the piano is in tune, you will hear one sound. Because even though those are individual strings capable of having different sounds, they are so tuned that it's one sound. And God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, three distinct persons, and yet one. And that's hard for us to wrap our heads around, because when we start talking about multiple personalities, that's dysfunctional. But when we understand it from a God perspective, it's God's ability to take everything and bring it into himself. And if you think of it in this way, it may help too. It's the relational needs we have that God meets through who he is. And so we all need to have God the Father. We all need Father. Even if we've never had it in an earthly sense, we need it. And he meets that need perfectly. We all need an older brother who would lay down his life for us. And that's who Jesus is. And then we need someone who is our counselor, who is our comfort, who is there for whatever is basically available for any need we have, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually. And that's how God presents himself with the Spirit. So all of them have different ways they function to bring about what we need. And yet Jesus said to the disciples, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Mm-hmm. So basically, there are three, yet one. It's somewhat of a mystery, and yet it's a simple truth.
Yeah, and as a parent, I was, again, personally raised in a Christian home, which I count a privilege. But raising my children in a Christian home, my recommendation is always talk about the three as if it's just an is. But there will come a time where you get to explain that. But you're now explaining something that they're used to hearing you talk about. Show Christ in your home. That is much more important than a biblical, the knowledge of the exact facts of how something works or doesn't work. They're more apt to understand that by watching your life than you someday saying, all right, today's the day we talk about the Trinity.
Absolutely.
All right, so last question. And I was very pleased this year. I mean, it was a change of things. We didn't have a bunch of what I considered COVID-related questions and no political questions, so that was fantastic.
Yes.
And this really isn't directly about COVID, but I know it's kind of affected things. But when do you think we'll get back to having the morning greeting?
That's a good question. As soon as your wife, Melissa, says it's okay.
She's that introvert type you were talking about. I don't think that has anything to do with... That's a little inside joke
I'll pay for later. No, I think that's an important thing, and yet one of the things we've tried to do through this whole process, and obviously not everybody's going to agree and not everybody's going to be happy, but one of the things we've tried to do is be sensitive to things that to me are obviously potential challenges. We still have our chairs. The rows are still distanced. We still do things in certain ways just so that we're not just ignoring the fact that there's still something going on out there. And I think that is part of that. I think it is something that we're not restricting people from greeting each other, but we're not forcing everybody into an activity that's going to create discomfort for some people. And so I think it's going to have to be further down the road than it is today for us to change that. And I think once we begin to find out that either it's become so mild in the symptoms that it's not something that there's any great risk to long-term effects, or we're going to have to be at a point where it has not continued to have new cases. And at the moment, the cases seem to be rising around the world. The good news is this new variant seems to not be near as deadly as some of the previous ones, but there is currently a rise of numbers of cases, and so it wouldn't be prudent to do that yet.
Yeah, so I can appreciate that, the reality of things. On the same token, I'll say this as an observer and one who isn't involved in making these type of decisions. Obviously, we're still a very social church.
Yes.
There is plenty of opportunity. I'm amazed with the people who come in early and spend time together, and I'm also amazed with the people who continue to hang around after church and spend time together. So it's definitely not an issue of trying to keep people apart, but it's also trying to make sure people are comfortable with where we are together. That's my observation.
Absolutely. I would agree with that totally. Absolutely.
Well, lots of answers, lots of questions today. I hope everybody here got a lot of information. You know, the one thing that I took away, I wrote it down a couple different times. You mentioned God's perfect plan. Perfect plan was brought up a lot. Relationship was brought up a lot. So I think as we go into this next year, I mean, there's opportunity for us to continue to grow together. I think all of us are aching for that a little bit after the last couple of years.
Absolutely.
So looking forward to what the new year may bring, and thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Corbin. You do a wonderful job and very much appreciate it. Thank you.